It might surprise you to know that we in the field of folklore actually have a fairly elaborate categorization system for folktales. What system exactly gets used varies from institution to institution. Most are some kind of variation on the Stith-Thompson system. The one we use here in Ireland is another variation on the Stith-Thompson system that was developed by Sean O'Sullivan and Rydar Christensen. This system has 8 broad categories and they are as such: animal tales, wonder tales, religious tales, romantic tales, tales of the stupid ogre, jokes and anecdotes, tall tales, and formula tales. Animal tales are stories You see this? You see this? You see? What have you wrought? What have you wrought? He's a very needy cat. You're a very needy cat. You fucking lamp. Go away. I think we're just gonna have to do the video with a cat. Okay, we're just gonna have to do the rest of this with a cat. Okay, here we go. Of course, that's where I was in the script. Animal tales are stories in which the main protagonist and most of the main characters are animals. This doesn't cover every kind of story that involves animals, however. For example, stories like Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby would be excellent examples of animal tales, whereas something like Puss in Boots, where there is only one talking animal most of the time, would not be. But wonder tales are any kind of story where magic and the supernatural are a major theme. If there's an awful lot of magic, then it's a wonder tale. For this, you would have things like, say, Cinderella would be a wonder tale. The next category is romance tales. And they're not actually about love. Romantic tales are they're more grounded. They have much less magical influence. They're something you could believe happened in the real world. An excellent example of romantic tales would be stories of Robin Hood. And then religious tales. These are usually about characters from religious texts, about major religious figures. They're usually almost semi-part of a belief system. Following that is Tales of the Stupid Ogre. This is the most ludicrously specific tale type that there is. It could be argued that the Three Billy Goats Gruff is a tale of the stupid ogre, but also simultaneously an animal tale. You'll notice as we go through this that the categories aren't actually very strict, and I'll get to the reason for that later. Next category, jokes and anecdotes. I don't need to explain that. Jokes are folklore, repeating the story your granny told you about how her day went, or about the fellow who made a fool of himself in the pub last week. Those are still folklore. Jokes and anecdotes. Tall tales are potentially plausible tales. You'd never believe the size of the fish I caught last week. But I had to let it go. That's a tall tale. And formula tales, lastly. These are stories in which there is a very, very specific pattern. What's a good example of a formula tale? Can you think of a good... Okay, alright. Right. These are stories in which there is a very specific pattern. A good example of this is The King with the Ass's Ears. Now, many people in Ireland think of this as a very specifically Irish story, but it actually comes up in lots of cultures all over the world. And always follows the same formula. Formula tales are quite closely related to migratory legends, as you may guess. Interestingly, most urban legends, which are a modern form of folklore, actually fit the classification of a formula tale. For example, I'm sure you've heard a story of someone going on holiday somewhere, or going on a date with someone they didn't know. They drink something a little bit funny, and they wake up the next morning in a bathtub full of ice in a strange place they don't remember, and they have a scar on their abdomen because their kidneys have been stolen. Now, the kidney heist is a very, very common urban legend. It's told in slight variations in many different countries all over the world. And that is an excellent example of a formula tale. Now, all of these categories have their own subcategories, of course. For example, all folk tales that involve fairies are a subset of wonder tale, and that subset is called fairy tales. All stories about fairies are fairy tales, and all fairy tales are a kind of wonder tale. And this is, of course, distinct from literary fairy tales. Literary fairy tale is a much broader category. It's closer to what wonder tale means. Peter Pan would be thought of as a literary fairy tale. Maybe Alice in Wonderland if you push it. But folktale fairy tales strictly have to have fairies. It's one of the very few places where the categorization system actually gets strict. A similar example would be hero tales, which are stories of great heroes such as Fionn McCool or Cuchulainn. Hero tales are usually a subset of wonder tale or romance tale, depending on just how fantastical it gets. But hero tales are not like fairy tales, they're not strict. You can have formula tales that are hero tales. You can have religious tales that are hero tales. The Voyage of St. Brendan would be a good example of that. Unlike fairy tales, most of the categories and subcategories are actually quite loose. The reason why we have these categories isn't so people who are trying to come up with stories know the strict definitions of what kind of story they're trying to write and what kind of features it would have. It's so that folklorists, people like me, can have an easier time looking up different kinds of stories. That's the only reason why categorization systems exist. It's to make it easier for people like me, folklorists, to look up different kinds of stories, see what kinds of examples of those stories we have, where they come from, how they compare to one another. And it makes it a little bit easier tracing the roots of migratory legends and things like that. That's the only reason we have this categorization system. Don't worry about whether or not your story fits it. You're back. You're back. You're making this very difficult. Get up here then. Come on. Come on. That'll keep him at least kind of quiet. At least the purring is less invasive to my audio. These categorizations, while they're made for folklorists, they can be useful to storytellers. Say, for example, you're interested in looking up different variations of the Cinderella story. You can simply look up the Stith-Thompson Index or a variation of it and look under Wonder Tales. Probably look directly under Fairy Tales and then look under Cinderella Tales. That category, the ultimate subcategory, is actually named after Cinderella. So if you wanted to find variations on that story from different countries, or where things turn out slightly differently, or the details are slightly different, that's where these classification systems are useful for storytellers. There, I think I'm actually done now. You're a pain in the hole. You're a pain in the hole. Tell him he's a pain in the hole. Tell him.